let's start with the Civil War, because we're in the midst of the sesquicentennial of
Yeah.
the Civil War, and people are talking about tracking it, not like they did 100 years ago. And I think of all your themes, it's probably the one that you can never shake. It's the
Right.
one that's closest to you. So what brought your focus to the American Civil War in the first place?
It is it's quite simply the most important event in American history. It is more important than our founding because there were enough unleft agendas in that founding that would send us hurtling towards the Civil War, and so much of what happens now, whether we're aware of it or not, are a consequence of that thing, the most important event in our history. And I had made several films before that, each, it seemed to me, quite distinct and different. The Brooklyn Bridge, the Shakers, the Statue of Liberty, Huey Long, the Congress, Thomas Hart Benton, all the films that preceded that, all had as a defining moment the Civil War behind it. The Brooklyn Bridge would not have been made without this new metal called steel, which the war helped to promote. The man who built the Brooklyn Bridge, Washington Roebling, got his practical training not just at RPI across the river, but building bridges for the Union Army. The Shakers declined precipitously, not just because of the sort of economic changes in the country, but the social and psychological and psychic changes that took place in a country that had just murdered 620, we now think perhaps 750,000 of their own people. Anywhere you turn, you couldn't escape this sort of sense of its centrality to everything that we are. It just sort of begged to be treated, and when you did talk to people about it, at least at that time, it was so out of fashion. You know, if you want to know about military history, they'd say, oh, go see old Professor so-and-so, as if, you know, only the causes and only the effects mattered. And of course, the causes matter hugely and the effects matter even more so. But it seemed to me that if you were going to sacrifice that many human lives, you ought to know what happened in the course of it.
We could spend all evening talking about the Civil War, but
we could watch the 11 and a half hours and then we could talk.
then we could talk. I think this group would do it. But I mean, how do you follow such an impactful documentary that had such a strong impact on the culture itself, but with frontal attacks on America's two great cultural inventions, baseball and jazz? Is that how you saw the follow-ups?
I actually made a little film called Empire of the Air immediately after the Civil War, but we had been planning baseball for a long time, and we thought it as a kind of sorbet course to sort of clear the palate after the horribleness of the war. You know, the soldiers, as you know, when they'd been in combat, said they'd seen the elephant, which is, I think, the most exotic otherness that they could describe. And we'd seen it too, working on it as you have, and it can sometimes give you a kind of shadow PTSD. So we were thinking this was different, but I almost immediately realized that I was making the sequel to the Civil War. And I realized that you could continue to study a presidential sort of military narrative, and that would be fine, as we normally think of American history as a sequence of presidential administrations punctuated by great calamities, wars, or depressions, or whatever. Or you could take this national pastime and see all of that and much, much more through it.
Eventually you decide that, this is your life. Eventually you decide, Ken Burns, that you would turn to the music itself.
You have my second grade teacher.
Here is Mrs. Mishkin from...
Everett.
You decide that it's time to bring the music from the background to the foreground.
Yes.
And you said, it's amazing to me to think, or to hear you say a few minutes ago that you didn't feel you knew enough about jazz.
I don't know anything about, I sort of make the same film over and over again, sort of asking sort of essential questions about who are we. But what I don't do is make something about something I know a lot about. I mean, I thought I knew something about baseball, and within a few weeks of working on it with the co-producer, Lynn Novick, you know, we just realized how little we knew. If you tell people what you already know and think they should know, that's called homework. If you share with them your process of discovery, that's something else. The DNA of what I do has to do with what archivists do. They save things of importance, and these things have a materiality, but they also have a potentiality, and it's our obligation to release that potential in the works that we do. And so it makes an award from archives and archivists that much more special to me. Thank you.